We've looked at a lot of ghost stories over the last couple of years here, and in response to those stories, I get accounts from people that are familiar with the tales and even had encounters of their own. But of course, I get responses from skeptics and critics as well. I welcome them all, though. On top of researching these stories, I've also been known to engage in paranormal investigations as well, especially back in the day. So I know full well that a skeptical mindset is almost a necessity in this field of work. One of the more popular arguments from skeptics for any case is the possibility that ghost stories arise from retellings of events over the years, elements being added here and there over generations, thus giving rise to ghosts involved in the stories, a way to sensationalize the original history. They say this happens time and time again. Well, today, I have one for you that has no ghost stories or sightings attached to it. And it's the perfect history to have a ghostly legend, but it doesn't. And it's that aspect that really caught my attention. No fakes or fraudsters have jumped on it as of yet. That lends hope to me that the practice of making up ghost stories and slapping them on historical events isn't as widespread as skeptics want us to believe. Maybe this story is just so chilling, mysterious, and macabre that it doesn't need a ghost story. Today, we'll look at the story behind Miss Elizabeth Evans Hall Dell Gibbons Flanagan Jeffries High Brown Route. Or we'll just simplify it to her maiden name, Miss Elizabeth Dale, the so-called Black Widow of Hazel Green. Everyone loves a good, strange, weird, or bizarre story. Well, welcome to the American South, where dark legends and haunted history lurk around every corner. Where superstition, folklore, and a touch of backwoods magic blend with everyday culture. Some say, in order to survive. This is Dixie After Dark. Elizabeth Dale was born on October 28, 1795, in Worcester, Maryland, the daughter of Revolutionary War veteran Adam Dale and wife Mary. Adam Dale, with his family in tow, became an early settler in Middle Tennessee, in the area of modern-day DeKalb County, building and running a successful mill there. After making a considerable amount of wealth in the venture, Adam Dale sold his holdings in the business, then moved his family to Maury County, Tennessee. By this time, Elizabeth Dale had already become accustomed to wealthy life, and at the age of 17, she was now married to a pastor, Reverend Samuel G. Gibbons. But when the Dale family up and moved, Elizabeth followed along, her husband following suit. In 1816, a few years after Elizabeth and Gibbons' marriage, Gibbons filed a will in Smith County, Tennessee at the age of 23, the timing of this document letting us know that he was roughly 2 years older than Elizabeth. In the will, he leaves his entire estate to his wife, with the exception of $100 to his sister and a shotgun for his nephew. 14 years later, Reverend Gibbons died near Centerville, Tennessee. His will had never been updated, and since he and Elizabeth Dale never had any children, she took over ownership of his entire estate. They were married just shy of 18 years. This would by no means be Elizabeth Dale's last relationship, but it would prove to be her longest. In just a year's time, Elizabeth was a bride once again, this time to Philip Flanagan, a union that would only last for 5 months, when Flanagan died in March 1832. Around a year and a half later, Elizabeth Dale was again at the altar, this time to Hazel Green, Alabama resident William Alexander Jeffries. Jeffries was the owner of a sizable plantation in Hazel Green, and a wealthy man in his own right. He had a 4-room cabin built atop an old Indian mound, a spot he picked to better survey his property from. According to stories, Jeffrey had met Elizabeth while she was still married to Flanagan, and when he learned of Flanagan's death, he made the trip back to Tennessee to start courting his widow. It's never made clear as to how the two met, but it's probably safe to assume that there were some business dealings between Flanagan and Jeffries. In short time, Elizabeth and Jeffries were married, and she moved to Hazel Green, Alabama with her new husband. It was in this third marriage that Elizabeth had children, a boy and a girl. After 5 years, Elizabeth added to her already sizable wealth when Jeffries passed away in 1838. And within the year, Elizabeth was married again in May of 1839. This time to Alabama House of Representative Robert A. High. High had been married a few times before himself, so the fact that Elizabeth had already outlived 3 husbands made no difference to him at all. Little did he know, though, he would become number 4 on the list of deceased husbands. Robert High passed away on February 16, 1841, months short of their 2-year anniversary. 5 years would pass before Elizabeth Dale would marry again. Husband number 5 would be Absalom Brown, a wealthy merchant in Hazel Green. The two were wed on March 16, 1846, and although Elizabeth's family's holdings, coupled with her inherited wealth and estates from her previous marriages, had made her a wealthy woman, she would use Brown's finances to build her dream home on top of the Indian mound she acquired from her marriage with husband number 3, William Alexander Jeffries. It took more than a year to build a grand 4-on-4 home, or a 2-story house, the bottom floor with 4 rooms and the second story with nearly identical rooms built atop them, overlooking the road that came into Hazel Green. The home was completed with the best furniture her husband's money could buy, and elegant gardens surrounded the house. Shortly after the completion of the home, though, Absalom Brown found himself as number 5 on the list of deceased husbands in 1847. It was Brown, death number 5, that started the rumor mill going. It's said that immediately after his death, the body started to severely swell, and that there was concerns that if it continued to swell at this rate, then the home's parlor where it was being displayed, as was customary in those days, could, well, become quite messy indeed. Elizabeth made the decision to have Brown buried that very night, just in case. That's when the speculation really took off. The talk was that Elizabeth must have poisoned Brown. That was their reasoning for the body reacting the way it did, and the nighttime funeral was Elizabeth's way of covering up the evidence. This kept the citizens of Hazel Green talking in hushed voices, and talk of the previous 4 other husbands was just icing on the cake. Not all of the residents believed in the rumors going around, though. Well, there was at least one that didn't. His name was William Rout, better known as husband number 6. They were wed a year after Brown's death in 1848. During this union, Elizabeth's parents came to live with her in Hazel Green, and although not one of Elizabeth's own husbands, her father, Adam Dale, would not be left out amongst the list of men in Elizabeth's life, dying while residing at her house in Hazel Green sometime around 1850. followed shortly by husband number 6, William Rout, a year later in 1851. Elizabeth's mother, Mary, left Hazel Green and moved back to Columbia, Tennessee, with another daughter. The rumors around Elizabeth Dale back in Alabama had continued to grow, though. Tales of the so-called Black Widow of Hazel Green eventually made their way into Tennessee and to her mother, Mary Dale. Mary persuaded her son-in-law, Nathan Vaught, to travel to Alabama and bring the remains of her husband, Adam Dale, back home to Tennessee. Adam was currently buried in the family cemetery on Elizabeth's property in Hazel Green, amongst the growing plots of former husbands. Nathan obliged, and this too would only add to the ever-growing rumors that swirled around Elizabeth Dale. When Adam Dale's remains were disinterred, they were found to be dark and petrified, a sure sign, at least in Nathan Vaught's mind, of poisoning. Even with all the rumors and speculation surrounding the now aging Elizabeth Dale, yet another man came calling at her door, D.H. Bingham. Elizabeth was close to 60 years old by this time, but it's said that she was still as beautiful as ever, and I'm sure the ever-growing wealth also helped entice these men into danger. They say that the only thing that saved Bingham from becoming husband number 7 was a man named Abner Tate. Now, there are 2 stories as to how Tate became involved with Elizabeth Dale. One says that Elizabeth's livestock had gotten into Tate's fields and destroyed his crops. The other story says that Tate had been pursuing Elizabeth for a wife himself, but she was more interested in Bingham. Either way, Tate became hell-bent on destroying Elizabeth's life, and the easiest way for him to do that was to take what everyone was saying around Hazel Green in hushed voices and be as loud as possible about it. And that's exactly what he did. But as soon as Abner was getting his campaign against Elizabeth going, he was shot by one of his slaves. The accepted story, at least as told around Hazel Green, was that Elizabeth Dale had hired one of her own slaves to do the deed, and that slave contracted the hit out to one of Tate's slaves. Abner Tate survived, though, and recovered from the gunshot wound, and he didn't slow down his verbal assaults on Elizabeth Dale. Not at all. That's when Elizabeth decided to use her new suitor, D.H. Bingham, to her favor. She convinced Bingham to make murder accusations against Tate. Oddly enough, there was talk going around for a while that Tate had killed a traveler from Kentucky on his own property and burned the body in his fireplace to get rid of the evidence. Now, I have no idea if this came out of left field one day or if there was something there to fuel those rumors, but whatever the case, Tate took it seriously and immediately went on the defensive. He had a pamphlet published and started distributing them around town, titled Defense of Abner Tate Against Charges of Murder Preferred by D.H. Bingham. An early precursor to online bashing, you could say, because even though Tate was trying to defend himself, he wrote in his pamphlet that Elizabeth's bridal house was a charnel house, around whose marriage couch 6 grinning skeletons were already hung. Elizabeth went on to file a $50,000 defamation suit against Tate, but in the court of public opinion, she had already lost. Before the court could even make a ruling, Elizabeth Dale sold her home in Hazel Green and moved to Mississippi, later dropping the lawsuit altogether against Abner Tate. Rumors continued to spin up around Elizabeth Dale, even though she was now gone. One of the more popular rumors was that there were 6 pegs by her front door on the inside of her former house, and hanging from them were hats, each one belonging to one of her dead husbands. Elizabeth Dale spent the rest of her life in Mississippi, and according to reports, she spent the rest of her life alone. There are no more reports of her taking any more husbands during her time in Mississippi. Elizabeth Dale died in Marshall County, Mississippi on May 7, 1866, at the age of 70. Her burial site is unknown. Whether Elizabeth Dale was truly a black widow or just a victim of some terrible luck in the marriage department will never be known. It seems that Elizabeth took that secret to the grave. The stories of the Black Widow of Hazel Green continue to be told all across North Alabama. The dark history weaves its way into local ghost stories and such in the area, and are told to children generation after generation. In fact, in 1982, songwriters Jim McBride and Stuart Harris were brainstorming for new ideas and took a break to swap ghost stories from their own childhoods. McBride remembered the story of the Black Widow of Hazel Green, and even though he misremembered Elizabeth's name as Rose, his telling became the very loose inspiration for a song that they called Rose in Paradise, which was released in 1987 by Waylon Jennings. Stories such as this always seem to intrigue people. Even myself. I've been known to catch myself binge-watching the TV show Snapped with my wife, first joking that she must be taking notes on ways to avoid capture in the future, but I always end up finding myself caught up in the stories myself. I've often found myself wondering how these guys keep finding themselves in these situations. But then again, an attractive woman with a shit pot of money, always looking to find a man. Yeah, you know who you are. I've called out our I can fix her bros here before. Y'all better watch yourselves out there.